and welcome to Radcast, the official radio show and podcast of the Society of Graduate Students at Western Ontario. I'm your host, Yousuf, and I'm joined here with my co-host,
Sarah Klapman.
And today we are here with Emmanuel Murray Leclair, who's doing his PhD in economics and also has some overlap with psychology. So we're really fascinated to have you on our show, Emmanuel.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm pleasure to be here.
So Emmanuel, tell us more about yourself and how you came to be interested in economics to begin with. What was your master's in?
Okay, so well, I started doing economics in undergrad. Not like I would say it was not a degree in economics, but it was like a joint degree in political science, philosophy and economics in Montreal. And I liked economics just because I could study issues that I would study in like political science, for example, but from a framework that's more like structured and more interesting, I would say, to like dive deep into.
Now, Emmanuel, did you just say you did some philosophy as well?
Yeah, I did. Like my undergrad was political science and economics, but I took a lot of courses in philosophy just because I was interested in that.
You're like I'm doing my PhD in philosophy, so I'm now even more excited than I was.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, I wanted at some point to do a master in philosophy, but I decided that I had to make a choice. So I decided to do economics. I guess part of the reason is like employment opportunities after school.
Yeah.
But you know, I like philosophy in general, and I like to learn about more what people think about the world and stuff. So yeah.
Cool.
That's really interesting. So tell us a little bit, if you would, about your research.
So right now I'm doing a paper on environmental regulation and how having regulation in specific region may increase pollution in unregulated region. And so I would say that like the intuition behind this research is quite, simple. There are things that, people kind of know and you can expect and think about, but the main issue is like methodological. How can I quantify these things? How can I observe that in the data? How can I measure changes in pollution? And so the big challenge that I'm working on right now is to like work with a model that tells me, what is the determinants of pollution of companies and how the companies are related between each other based on the type of product that they sell and the kind of market that they operate in. And so all of these pieces together to try to understand determinants of pollution.
Right. And you mentioned that in your summer research paper or just paper that you're working on, there's this, you're utilizing on the concept of carbon leakage and how, maybe having regulations in a particular region regulations say imposing carbon taxes, for example, in a particular region may result in an increase in pollution in other regions. Tell us more about carbon leakage and the kind of research you're working on right now.
So carbon leakage is or people also, there's another word for it, but it's not exactly the same. It's called pollution halving. And it's basically the idea that, as developed countries like Canada or European Union, the US, regulate pollution, the production of polluting goods, like especially you think about manufacturing stuff, may shift towards region in the world that are less regulated, right? And the idea behind this kind of reasoning is a simple economic reasoning of the fact that it's more expensive to produce the good at home, then it's cheaper to just buy it from a cheaper place and import it at home, right? And so this is the basic idea underlying the carbon leakage issue. And in my opinion, one thing that's interesting about that is if that keeps happening more and more developed countries do that, then you have an effect of concentrating pollution in specific unregulated region. And so, this is, some people may think this is an issue. I'm curious to know more about that. So
yeah, that's a follow-up as well. So what do you think if that is proven to be the case in your studies as well in some interesting manner? What do you think the solution may look like? Would you propose, for example, that maybe one remedy is that we don't have unregulated areas and somehow there's a whole scale effect, thereby avoiding the carbon leakage issue or mitigating it in some important way, or maybe not have as many regulations to begin with?
Yeah,
Where would you like?
I think this is a very good point, and the literature actually in economics has proposed the main solution that is proposed is something called import tariffs, and or like border. I think it's called border import tariffs or something like that, and it's basically saying like, let's say I'm a country like Canada, and I regulate some manufacturing industry, and I'm scared that the production was going to move to China, and we're going to import those goods. Then what I can do is that I can tax the import of that specific good, and to kind of like buy the same amount of the carbon tax or something to try to mitigate the leakage. But there's some more deeper issue about leakage, because if it just changes the prices that people pay, then that may not be able to have, that may not be sufficient. And another issue is like, let's say you have 3 countries. So let's say I take Canada, China, and India, for example. And let's just assume that Canada supplies China or India, okay? And then Canada decides to regulate carbon, and then what happens is that the trade between China and India can increase, right? And so it doesn't have to be necessarily like related to Canada. So this is also an issue that you may not be able to deal with these kind of tariffs. If that made any sense.
Interesting. Yeah. So it sounds a bit like you're describing sort of outsourcing pollution from countries that can afford it to countries that can't. And that's interesting, because to me, as somebody who knows nothing about economics, it sounds a little bit like an economics take on environmentalism, but of course much more sort of capitalistic. Do you ever find that your research runs up against those two poles of sort of environmental protectionism versus economic protectionism?
So yeah, so there's a lot of people that are working on like sort of trying to make sure that the industry stay competitive and things like that. And that's not really like my line of research, but I would say that this is a fundamental question of how do we view the world, right? So this kind of research is a positive research in the sense that we want to draw empirical observation from things that are happening, right? So is the world operating in a capitalist way? Are the firms behaving that way or not? Like, this is the underlying fundamental question. And if they are behaving that way, then this is the better framework, I think, to study these things, right? Yeah.
So that's really fascinating, but also got my attention a lot. And I don't know, you took some psychology courses as well?
Not a lot of psychology courses, but I studied a little bit in the past 2 years. It's an area of research in economics that is very linked to psychology and the development of like human life. And yeah, using,
so this is really fascinating. You mentioned in your abstract that you've also studied the relationship between economic environments of individuals, say, for example, parental wealth, for example, as an economic factor, and compared that with the relationship of cognitive development in that particular individual.
Yeah,
that's super cool. And could you share more with us more on these particular relations?
Yeah, and just before I do that, I would like to shout out the Western Economics Department, because they are very, I would say, active in this area. And this is like because they have done research in that, and the advisors of professors here have done a lot of research in that. And some of the fundamental question underlying this is understanding when let's say I'm a policymaker and I want to intervene in the economy to sort of alleviate poverty or kind of make wealth more equal or something like that. Should I do it when the kids are very young? So like before they enter school? Should I do it when they're in high school? Should I do it when they're in college? And so by trying to understand when we should intervene and what kind of intervention we should do, then like economists have started to study like the process that the cognitive evolution of people and how different incentives in terms of like the wealth that your parents have, you know, because if your parents are more wealthy, maybe you're going to go to a better school and stuff like that. And then studying that in a framework that is sort of like very structured. So like trying to form experiments where you would draw like randomly people, and you would say like those people I send to this random school, and these people I don't, and if these people are ex ante similar, then observing the effect on their cognitive ability in terms of like how they perform in test scores later on, and other sort of like emotional well-being and things like that. And I guess one of the main point underlying this is like human development is economic development. That's what economists say about that. And so if people are better, the economy will be better. But I think it's interesting for its own purpose just to study that, right? It's not necessarily to make the economy better. That's personally my view, but yeah.
That is really interesting, the idea that the economy is people.
Yeah.
Because I've always thought of the economy as a construct, a human construct, right? Because I'm pretty sure you can argue that pretty strongly.
Yeah, sure.
So do you ever think about the way in which people interact with the economy and then the economy sort of responds to that? Because here you're talking a little bit about how if you create economic interventions in early childhood, people are different, and then that cycles back into changing the economy. Are there other interactions that occur not just like in early childhood?
I mean, there are a lot of different things that can happen. For example, let's think like during COVID, if the government is giving money to, I mean, like trying to understand like what are the determinants of well-being related to the economy. So let's say people are getting laid off because of COVID, and then the government gives them money. Like one of the questions that you may want to know is that sufficient? Not for the economy necessarily, but for people's well-being to just have money, or is it better for them to have employment?
Right.
And so I don't know. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but you know, things like that you can study.
Well, I was wondering, given how the situations have changed for all of us as graduate students given COVID-19, how does this new situation change or impact your research and your academic life? Would you like to share something on that?
Yeah, for sure. So I would say that my research, so it's kind of like hard to know because I started working on this paper the moment that COVID started. And so I would say that this paper so far has been going well, but I in terms of academic life, it's been very, very impactful. Like for me, I feel way more isolated than before. And it's kind of weird because it's as if like mentally I'm going back 10 years, you know, because like, it's weird to say, but it's like back in like 10 years ago before I left my parents' house to go to college or whatever, living in their home and not having to get social life. I feel a little bit like that now, you know, while I've been like building a life in the past 10 years to kind of like emancipate from that. So it's kind of weird to do that right now, to be at home and working from home. I'm not a fan, to be honest. Like I like to work with people and because research is kind of isolating already because you're working a lot alone. And so having social interaction is very important for me.
Well, how do you think this situation can improve a lot for you or any other researcher who may be feeling the same, going through the same kinds of experiences that you are?
I think that, so I don't know like how Western is doing, but like the econ department is gradually allowing students with like very, I guess, rigorous measures of health in the school. So like wearing a mask and stuff. And I think like it would be nice if people decide to go to school, like people that are in PhD and faculty members, to still go to school and you know, just take the COVID as like a precaution that you have to take in your social interactions, but not distantiate yourself from others, you know, and try to live normal life. I think that's very important.
Mm-hmm. Do you, you mentioned earlier an example in which COVID had an effect on the economy and on people who were being given the sort of benefit. Has this situation inspired you to change the direction of your research or brought anything else into it because it's just so unprecedented?
Definitely, like, so we were talking a little bit about psychology, and I'm very curious about understanding the effect of COVID just on the mental health of people, and not necessarily things that are related to the economy, but like more like a lack of economy or whatever you could call that, on how people feel and how people interact with others, and what does this cause. And I'm very curious about like understanding people, you know.
Yeah, it seems that maybe this situation may bring some positives for you in some ways, because maybe your direction, your research direction might change in a more sort of even more applied sense,
Yeah.
in how people are being impacted, their mental health, and using your economic resources to tackle some difficulties that may impact policies as well.
Yeah,
So
definitely. Yeah. I think like exactly as you're saying, it's something I'm considering and I have to think about, but I want to study these things, and I would like to use economic methodology, which uses math and some tools that we have that maybe other fields don't have, to study these things, mental health or things like that. But for me, mental health is it's very hard to think empirically about it, because it seems like very personal. You know, when I think about, for example, my mental health, I think about the experience of my life, and I think about such detailed stuff, and people may be able to relate to certain things, but every individual's life is unique, and trying to put things in a systematic way, I'm always wondering if that's the right approach to understanding, right?
Mm-hmm. So I'm very interested in your research, and it's very new to me, because I don't know much about economics, but I do think that the fact that you're pulling together economics and psychology is really interesting. I did a psychology undergrad, so I'm a little
Wow, that's cool.
but do you ever wonder about the psychology of money and economics, and how that like shapes people throughout their lives, and what the world would look like if we were in a different economic system? I know that's a big question, I just threw it at you, but sometimes I think about that and I wonder what your take is.
Yeah, I think that's it's a very hard question, and there are people in behavioral economics that are studying how, I mean, there's different questions related to that. So it's like, how do people perceive money? So okay, I'll give you an example that I think may be relevant. It's something called, what is it called again? Let me just try to remember. Okay, so first there's something called inattention, which is basically when you go in everyday life, buying things and things like that, you may not be like very aware of all the choices that are available to you, and you may buy things repeatedly, and it may not be quote unquote rational. So economists have studied that. I'm not super interested in that. And then there's this other idea that I forgot the name. It's some form of discounting. Did you guys hear that part? Yeah, okay, so I'm not gonna repeat that. But yeah, there's a lot of like studies that try to understand the psychology of money. And one part that I'm interested in that's not very economics is the understanding of gambling, and understanding of like how your mind works when you're doing gambling. And I think that would be very interesting, because it seems like to me, because I read some books about that, that when you're gambling, or maybe you become so obsessed that the whole world disappears, you know, and you forget everything, and you become sort of like in a void, right? And that's why people do it for like 14 hours in a row. And I'm very curious about that, because this is related to like the incentive of money, right? That makes you do this. And I would like to know why, what leads to this kind of obsession? Yeah.
Right. I mean, gambling could become a kind of addiction. I mean, I can relate it to, say, for example, gaming, which may not have a money aspect to it, but yeah, I mean, 14 hours, or we can go much more than that.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. I can relate to that too. So I really understand this type of, I think like as a person, I tend to be sometimes obsessive, even with research. Like I will like tunnel vision a problem so hard, and I just cannot take my mind off it, and I completely forget around it, the bigger picture and stuff like that. And it seems to be a recurring theme in my life. So understanding that is kind of, yeah.
Yeah, my background is I study music neuroscience, and the areas of the brain, the reward systems that are involved in things like gambling and addictions, because they just make you feel so good. It's really neat because it's also involved in things like food and sex and like things that are actually good for you and things that your body wants you to continue doing because they'll keep you alive and help the species evolve. But things like that hijack the system, like drugs or like addictions or like music, actually. It's just such an interesting little like back entry into such an important brain area. So I think there's a lot of cool research you could be doing, especially from an economics perspective. I've never heard anything like that. That's really cool.
I was curious, is it like dopamine?
Yeah, absolutely.
That?
Yeah.
Can you get addicted to like dopamine in the sense that can you get addicted to that?
You get addicted to the feeling, and dopamine is sort of the neural precursor to that. But ultimately, you get addicted to whatever feels good, and that can be very different for different people, right? Like, I mean, that's not my research, so I can't really speak to it. But I do think it's very neat that money has this very reinforcing quality, because obviously if you have money, then you by extension have all these other things that you could want. But it's interesting to me that people are rewarded by having money as opposed to money because it can buy you something else.
Yeah, definitely. I think this is a very important distinction. And I'm just curious because for me, money is not like a big driving factor in my life. I think it's part of the reason I'm doing a PhD, but just in general, it's very weird to study economics when I'm not like, because a lot of my colleagues, they like money, they like to study money. I'm not super interested in money. Like, to me, that's not so interesting, but I don't know. It's just how I feel.
So Emmanuel, sorry, you wanted to say something?
No, it's okay. I was just, go ahead.
Sure. I was just thinking, besides the connection between economics and psychology, what other kinds of topics have interest you that you think you might pursue in the coming year, for example, or it's worth considering?
Okay, so so you said besides psychology and economics?
Yeah.
So,
or some aspect of that would be also.
I mean,
to share.
I've not taught like a very big picture, but I have a couple things that I'm curious about. So one is understanding the determinants of like when people age, and I think like this relates to neuroscience a little bit. It is like I'm kind of curious to know what happens like in terms of your cognitive ability. Like, is age such a large factor that near the end of your life it doesn't matter what you did throughout your life, now how smart you were, or does that matter? And I attended the neuroscience day, I think, or some kind of conference at Western in winter, because I was curious about that, and the speaker was discussing this, and a lot of these things were in clinical settings, right? And I thought we have very interesting data in economics with these kind of things, but that's a very different data because it's observational, and you have say a more representative population. And I thought maybe we could try to answer some of these questions using our type of data and methodology. Yeah.
That sounds really neat. Yeah. Those are good questions. And again, approaching it from an econ perspective is very different from sort of a clinical perspective, which is really where I've been. I was at Neuro Research Day, and my research involves older folks. So it's always good to hear that people care about older people. That's it's very exciting.
I'm curious about that because I don't know, like, I know that I'm still young, but I'm curious about the end of life. And part of the reason for that is I remember seeing my grandma a couple years ago that was 97, and when I saw her like soon, like very not short before she died, she had forgotten everything about her life, and that just made me question so many things, or like just so yeah, that's why I'm kind of curious about understanding that. And yeah, so
right. So that I mean, it's quite something when your research is impacted by some of your own personal lived experiences. and it leads you to directions that you may not have thought before to explore. Wow, yeah. And yeah,
I agree. I think even talking to you guys today during this interview, it's making me think that, and I think I would like to take that direction. But there are so many questions that are interesting, and so it's hard to decide with research.
That is super cool. I mean, it's wonderful to have conversations where we all learn something from each other, and if it helps motivate people to think in areas that they were not thinking too much, I mean, that's amazing. And it should be one of the slogans of Gradcast as well.
Yeah, no, I agree.
So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, this has felt like a really interdisciplinary conversation, which is my favorite kind. And I am very excited to see what kind of additional tools and benefits you can bring from an economics perspective, because it seems like you're interested in all these other like related but separate fields. And that's a really cool approach to take, because often people get so siloed in their discipline. So this is a very fascinating part, like using the tools of economics to study these things. And I don't know how, like, are you guys familiar with math just in general? Because I mean, there's a couple famous papers in economics that really like led this kind of movements of studying some of these things. And one of the main authors, his name is James Heckman, and he has written papers that are studying that. And if you guys ever read this, or you write his name on YouTube, he has won a Nobel Prize, and he is very interesting to listen to, because you will hear this kind of approach to studying and psychology.
What's his name?
I'll write it in the chat, but his name is James Heckman.
Okay, for all our viewers to know as well. That's fantastic. Yeah. So we're running out of time. We'll definitely check out James Heckman as well. So Emmanuel, are there any social media links that you want to share with us as well?
Sure. My email address is like emurray@uwo.ca, and people can also find me on Facebook. If you like send me a message, I'll answer you. And I also have a Twitter, but you can message me there. Although I don't have a picture and I never posted anything, I will know that someone messaged me.
Perfect, Emmanuel. So this has been the Gradcast, the official radio show and podcast of the Society of Graduate Students at Western Ontario. I've been your host, Yousuf, and my co-host was
Sarah Klapman.
We've been speaking with Emmanuel Murray Leclair, and this episode was produced by Gavin Tolometti. I may have mispronounced that, forgive me for that. If you would like to be involved with the show or get in contact with us, email us at gradcastradio@gmail.com. You can also follow us on Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter at Gradcast Radio. To listen to us, we are on the radio at CHRW 94.9 FM. You can also find us all of our episodes on our website at gradcast.ca, or on podcast apps like Podbean, iTunes, and Spotify. Alternatively, select podcasts have been uploaded to YouTube at Gradcast Radio. Thank you for listening, and have a wonderful night.